Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. The Maple Hollow General Store, nestled deep in the Vermont woods, used to be just that, a store. A place where folks came for milk, bread, and a bit of gossip. And the bell above the door. It had a cheerful, almost musical chime, like a little welcome home. But that was before. Now it just clangs, a flat, dead sound that seems to suck the very air out of the room, swallowed by the gloom that's begun to seep, slow and steady, from the ancient water-stained planks of the shelves. Vermont nights here, they aren't just long. They stretch. See? They stretch out, thin and cold, an endless, suffocating quiet that wraps around everything like a shroud. I'm just the cashier, same as always, my fingers often stiff on the cold plastic keys of the register, punching in prices for the same few items, for the same few faces that seem to blur more and more each week. Their hushed whispers, when they speak at all, are barely audible over the tired hum of the old freezer. A sound that started to feel less like machinery and more like a low, constant sigh. But it's not the customers that make the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Not anymore. It's the store itself. The air inside, it's grown thick, like trying to breathe through wet wool, heavy with a presence that feels like it's always just out of sight, lurking in the periphery. A silent, ancient weight, pressing down. Every creak of the floorboards isn't just old wood settling. Not when you've heard it 1,000 times before and it still makes you jump. No, it's a step. And every rustle from the back aisles, where the light struggles to reach. That's not just a draft from a loose window pane. That's a breath. When the last customer finally shuffles out, their footsteps fading into the black, and the only light left is the sickly, buzzing glow of the fluorescent tubes. I don't just hear the silence. I feel it. It presses in, vast and cold, a living thing, listening, waiting, and always, always aware of me. And sometimes, just before I lock up, I swear I can feel it smiling. My name's Ethan Bouchard, and I ended up in this forgotten corner of Vermont 3 months ago, when my college plans fell through. Couldn't afford another semester at UVM, so I took the Greyhound from Burlington with nothing but a duffel bag and my grandmother's address scrawled on a napkin. She'd left me this job, some arrangement with the previous owner before he disappeared last winter. The locals in town don't talk much about what happened to old Henrik Lindqvist, just shake their heads when his name comes up at Dutton's Diner. The store sits on Route 100, about 15 miles north of Waterbury, where the asphalt starts to crack and the forest crowds in close enough to scrape your car mirrors. There's no cell service out here, no GPS that bothers to acknowledge our existence. Just me, the register, and something else that's been watching from the shadows between the Campbell's soup and the motor oil since the day I started. Something that's getting hungrier. It was Margot Caron who first mentioned the rules. She came in every Tuesday for her weekly groceries. Always the same items, always paid in exact change from a little leather coin purse that looked older than the store itself. Margot had lived in Maple Hollow her whole life, spoke with that thick Vermont accent that turned car into caw and made every sentence sound like a question, even when it wasn't. "You been following Henrik's protocols, eh ya?" she asked while I rang up her gallon of milk and loaf of King Arthur bread. The register drawer stuck like it always did, requiring a sharp jab with my hip to open. Protocols? I looked up from counting her change. Nobody mentioned any protocols. Margot's weathered face went pale. She glanced around the store like she expected someone to be listening, though we were the only two people there. The afternoon light filtered through the grimy windows, catching dust motes that seemed to dance just a little too purposefully. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice dropping to barely more than a breath. "Henrik left you instructions, didn't he? Written down somewhere?" I shook my head. The only thing Henrik had left was a ring of keys and a note saying the register combination was 0418. Margot grabbed my wrist across the counter, her fingers surprisingly strong for an 80-year-old woman. "You go look," she said. "Tonight, after you close. Look real good. Behind the counter, under things, in the office. Henrik wouldn't have left you here without them." She took her groceries and hurried out, the doorbell making that awful dead clang. I watched her ancient Subaru Outback disappear down Route 100, leaving me alone with questions that made my stomach twist. That night, after the last customer left at 8:30, I started searching. The office behind the counter was barely bigger than a closet, crammed with boxes of old receipts and inventory sheets dating back to the 1990s. I pulled everything out, checking behind the filing cabinet, under the desk, inside every drawer. Nothing. I was about to give up when I noticed something odd about the bottom drawer of Henrik's desk. It was shorter than the others, maybe 6 inches of space missing. I ran my fingers along the back panel and felt a slight gap. When I pressed, the false back plopped open with a soft click. Inside was a manila envelope marked "For the New Guy" in Henrik's shaky handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Night shift protocols, Maple Hollow General Store." These are not suggestions. 1. Never look directly at the security mirror above aisle 3 between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Peripheral vision only. What you see in there doesn't match what's actually in the aisle. 2. If you hear the coffee pot brewing after 10 p.m., let it finish. Do not drink the coffee. Do not look at the coffee. Pour it down the sink drain immediately, and rinse the pot twice. 3. The old man in the red flannel will come in every Thursday around midnight. He will buy exactly $7.33 worth of items. Do not ask for ID. Do not speak to him unless he speaks first. He died in 1987. 4. Keep the radio on AM 1240 all night. If it goes to static, turn the volume up. If you hear your name being called through the static, do not answer. 5. Something lives in the freezer section. You will hear it moving around back there after closing. Do not investigate. Do not open any freezer doors after 9 p.m. 6. If the lights in aisle 7 start flickering, walk to the front of the store and count inventory. Out loud. Start with register tape, then cigarettes, then lottery tickets. The flickering will stop. 7. Lock the front door at exactly 9 p.m. If someone tries to come in after that, especially if they're someone you recognize, do not let them in. That's not them anymore. At the bottom of the page, Henrik had scrawled a note. Kid, I lasted 43 years by following these rules. Some nights were worse than others, but I followed them every single time. You do the same. You might make it to retirement. Break even 1, and what happened to the Miller boy in 98 will seem like a mercy. Good luck. H.L. I read the list 3 times, each pass making it feel more surreal. My first instinct was to laugh. It read like something from a creepypasta forum, not actual instructions for a rural Vermont general store. But then I remembered Margot's face, the genuine fear in her eyes, the way she'd grabbed my wrist. And I remembered Henrik's sudden disappearance. According to the locals, Henrik Lindqvist had worked at the store since 1979. He'd been there 6 days a week, reliable as sunrise, until one February morning when he simply didn't show up. They found his truck in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition, but Henrik was gone. The state police had searched the woods for weeks, dragging the pond behind the store, checking every hunting cabin within 50 miles. They never found him. I folded the paper and slipped it into my jeans pocket. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the back of the store, I heard what sounded like footsteps. Slow, measured steps moving between the aisles. I checked my watch. 9:47 p.m. The freezer section hummed to life with a sound I'd never noticed before. Not quite mechanical, not quite organic. Like breathing through water. I grabbed Henrik's keys from under the register and walked to the front door, my sneakers squeaking against the worn linoleum. As I turned the deadbolt, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Something tall and wrong-shaped, standing perfectly still at the end of aisle 3. I kept my eyes fixed on the door and locked up for the night. The next evening came too fast. I'd spent most of Tuesday trying to convince myself Henrik's rules were just an elaborate prank, maybe something the old-timers cooked up to mess with the new guy from Burlington. But when Margot came in for her weekly shopping, she took one look at my face and nodded grimly. "You found them," she said, not a question. "Yeah." I scanned her milk and bread, same routine as always. "Margot, what happened to the Miller boy?" Her coin purse snapped shut with a sharp click. "That's not for me to say, honey, but you follow those rules here? Every single one." By 8:30, the store was empty except for me and whatever lived in the freezer section. I've been hyper-aware of every sound from back there all day. The normal hum of the units, the occasional click of the compressors cycling on and off, and underneath it all, something else. A rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against glass. I pulled Henrik's list from my pocket and read it again. The paper felt heavier than it should, like the words carried actual weight. At exactly 9 p.m., I walked to the front door and turned the deadbolt. The sound echoed through the store, final and absolute. I was committed now, locked in with whatever called this place home after dark. The radio sat on a shelf behind the counter, an old Panasonic AM/FM unit probably from the 80s. I tuned it to 12:40 a.m. and was rewarded with static broken occasionally by what sounded like a distant talk show. A man with a gravelly voice discussing baseball scores from games I was pretty sure had ended hours ago. Time crawled. I reorganized the cigarette display twice, restocked the candy bars, and cleaned the coffee station until the steel surfaces gleamed. The pot sat cold and empty, its heating element dark, normal, safe. At 10:17 p.m., it started brewing. The sound hit me like a physical blow, that familiar gurgling, bubbling noise that coffee pots make, except there was no water in the reservoir, no coffee grounds in the filter. No one had touched the power switch. I stood behind the counter, watching steam rise from the empty pot as some phantom force brewed coffee from nothing. The smell filled the air, rich, dark, inviting. My mouth watered despite the wrongness of it all. I hadn't eaten since lunch, and the aroma made my stomach growl. Do not drink the coffee. Do not look at the coffee. I kept my eyes fixed on the lottery ticket display while the brewing cycle completed. When the gurgling finally stopped, I counted to 10 before turning around. The pot was full of something that looked like coffee, but moved too slowly when I tilted it, thick as motor oil. I dumped it down the sink drain, watching the black liquid spiral away. It left stains on the stainless steel that no amount of scrubbing could remove. I rinsed the pot twice, just like Henrik had written, and put it back on the burner. The whole process took maybe 5 minutes, but my hands were shaking when I finished. Around 11:30, I heard movement from aisle 3. Not footsteps exactly, more like something being dragged across the floor. A soft scraping sound that raised goosebumps along my arms. I remembered rule number 1 and kept my eyes carefully averted from the security mirror mounted above that aisle. The mirror had been installed sometime in the 90s, one of those convex ones designed to give you a wide view of the store to catch shoplifters. During the day, it reflected exactly what you'd expect. Customers browsing, kids sneaking candy, the usual stuff. But now, in my peripheral vision, I could see shapes moving in its surface that didn't match anything happening in the actual aisles. Something tall and twisted, bending in ways that hurt to think about. Something with too many joints, moving between the shelves like it was shopping for items that weren't there. In the mirror, aisle 3 wasn't stocked with paper towels and cleaning supplies. It was full of things I couldn't quite make out, wrapped in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. I focused on my inventory list instead, counting cigarette cartons out loud. Marlboro Red, 12 cartons. Camel Lights, 8 cartons. American Spirit, 6 cartons. The dragging sound stopped. Whatever was in aisle 3, or in the mirror's version of aisle 3, had heard me. I could feel it listening, waiting to see what I'd do next. My voice wanted to crack, to trail off into whispered terror, but I kept counting. Newport Menthol, 4 cartons. Parliament, 3 cartons. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the presence moved away. I heard the scraping resume, growing fainter as whatever it was retreated toward the back of the store. I didn't look up from my inventory sheet until my watch showed 12:15 a.m. The radio crackled, and for a moment I heard something that made my blood freeze. A voice calling my name through the static. Ethan. Ethan Bouchard. It sounded like my grandmother, the way she used to call me in for dinner when I was little. My hand moved toward the volume knob before I caught myself. Rule number 4. If you hear your name being called through the static, do not answer. I jerked my hand back and turned the volume up instead. The voice faded, replaced by more static, and eventually another baseball broadcast, this one discussing trades that hadn't happened yet. Time became elastic after that. Minutes stretched like taffy while I waited for something else to go wrong. I cleaned the same surfaces repeatedly, reorganized the magazine rack 3 times, and checked the locks on the beer cooler doors, even though I knew they were secure. Around 2 a.m., I made the mistake of walking too close to the freezer section. The sounds from back there had been getting louder all night. Scratching, tapping, something that sounded almost like purring. As I passed the frozen foods aisle, one of the freezer doors suddenly fogged up from the inside. Condensation shouldn't work that way, not when the cold was supposed to be on the inside. But there it was. And then something pressed against the glass from within. A handprint appeared in the fog, pale and spread wide against the interior of the door. Then another. Then something that might have been a face. Features too distorted by the condensation to make out clearly. It was trying to get out, pressing itself against the barrier that separated it from my world. I backed away slowly, keeping my footsteps soft against the linoleum. The handprints followed my movement, sliding across the glass like whatever was making them was tracking me. Other freezer doors began fogging up too, more shapes pressing against them from impossible spaces. I retreated to the front counter and stayed there for the rest of the night. By 3 a.m., most of the supernatural activity had died down. The radio played normal late-night programming. The freezers went quiet, and the security mirror showed nothing but empty aisles stocked with ordinary products. I unlocked the front door at exactly 6 a.m. when daylight began filtering through the grimy windows. My first customer was Tom Dubois, a local contractor who came in every morning for coffee and a breakfast sandwich from the hot food warmer. "Morning, Ethan," he said, looking perfectly normal and human. "How'd your first night go?" I rang up his coffee and egg sandwich, my hands steadier than they had any right to be. "Fine," I said. "Just fine." Tom nodded and headed out to his work truck, whistling some tune I didn't recognize. Through the window, I watched him drive away toward the morning light, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. One night down. God knew how many more to go. By Thursday night, I'd developed a routine. 3 nights of following Henrik's rules had taught me the rhythm of the store after dark. The coffee pot would start its phantom brewing around 10:15. The thing in the freezer section got active around 11:30, pressing against the glass doors until they fogged over with condensation that had no business existing. The radio would try to call my name through static bursts, sometime between midnight and 1 a.m., always in voices I recognized. My grandmother, my high school girlfriend Sarah, even my old roommate from UVM. I'd learned to navigate it all without looking where I shouldn't look, without answering what I shouldn't answer, without investigating sounds that had no earthly source. But Thursday night was different. Thursday night brought rule number 3. The day shift had been busier than usual. Leaf peepers were starting to arrive for Vermont's famous fall foliage, their SUVs with Massachusetts and Connecticut plates stopping for bottled water and overpriced snacks. Most of them seemed nervous about driving Route 100 after dark, and I didn't blame them. The road twisted through forests that seemed to swallow headlight beams, past abandoned farmhouses where broken windows stared like dead eyes. Around 7 p.m., a woman from New Jersey asked me about hotels in the area. I directed her to the Comfort Inn in Waterbury, about 15 miles south. "You don't want to be driving these roads at night," I told her. "Lots of deer, bad visibility." She laughed. "Come on, how bad could it be?" I didn't answer that. Some truths weren't meant for tourists. By 9 p.m., I was alone again. The deadbolt turned with its usual finality, sealing me inside with whatever shared these walls. The radio crackled to life on AM 1240, broadcasting what sounded like a late-night call-in show from somewhere in Canada. French and English mixed together in a dialect I couldn't quite follow. I settled in behind the counter with Henrik's rules spread on the worn Formica surface. Rule number 3 stared back at me. The old man in the red flannel will come in every Thursday around midnight. He will buy exactly $7.33 worth of items. Do not ask for ID. Do not speak to him unless he speaks first. He died in 1987. My watch read 9:47 p.m. Just over 2 hours to wait. The phantom coffee started brewing at 10:11. I went through the routine. Don't look, don't drink. Pour the thick substance down the drain. Rinse twice. The stains it left on the sink seemed darker tonight, more permanent. I wondered how many times Henrik had performed this same ritual. How many gallons of whatever it was had gone down that drain over the decades. Around 11, the lights in aisle 7 began their familiar flicker. I walked to the front of the store and started counting inventory out loud, my voice echoing in the empty space. Register tape, 4 rolls. Marlboro Red, 11 cartons. Camel Lights, 7 cartons. The flickering stopped after I reached the lottery tickets, same as always. But tonight, something was different about the freezer section. The sounds were louder, more aggressive. Not just tapping and scratching, but what sounded like banging. Like something was throwing itself against the doors from the inside, desperate to get out. The entire row of freezer units shook with each impact. I stayed behind the counter, and tried not to think about what would happen if those doors actually opened. Midnight approached with agonizing slowness. I checked my watch every few minutes, watching the hands crawl toward the witching hour. 11:47, 11:52, 11:58. At exactly 12 a.m., the front doorbell clanged. I looked up and nearly gasped. A man stood just inside the entrance, though I hadn't seen him approach, and I was certain the door was locked. He was maybe 60 years old, wearing a red and black checkered flannel shirt that looked like it had seen better decades. His hair was gray and thinning, combed neatly to one side. He looked perfectly ordinary except for his eyes, which were the flat, colorless gray of January ice. And he wasn't breathing. I watched his chest for nearly a minute. I never saw it rise or fall. The old man walked through the store with purposeful steps, his boots making no sound on the linoleum. He moved through the aisles like he knew exactly where everything was, picking up items with practiced efficiency. A can of Dinty Moore beef stew, a sleeve of saltine crackers, a small bottle of aspirin, a package of beef jerky. I wanted to watch him shop, but something about his presence made my skin crawl. Instead, I focused on the register, pretending to organize the receipt roll while listening to his movements. He walked like Henrik had described, with purpose, like a man completing a familiar routine. When he approached the counter, I forced myself to look up and smile. The dead man's face was pleasantly neutral, almost kind. He placed his items on the counter. The beef stew, $1.89. Crackers, $1.25. Aspirin, $2.99. And beef jerky, $1.20. I rang them up without speaking. The total came to exactly $7.33. He pulled out a leather wallet that looked like it had been buried and dug up again, the leather cracked and stained with things I didn't want to identify. From it, he counted exact change: $7 bills, a quarter, and 8 pennies. His fingers were ice cold when they brushed mine during the exchange. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying the faint accent of someone who'd grown up speaking French first. "Have a good evening." "You too," I managed, though my throat felt like sandpaper. He gathered his purchases and walked toward the door. I expected him to struggle with the deadbolt, but he passed right through the glass like it wasn't there. The bell didn't ring. One moment he was inside the store. The next he was walking across the parking lot toward the tree line, his red flannel visible in the pale moonlight, until the forest swallowed him completely. I sat behind the register for a long time after that, processing what I'd just witnessed. A dead man buying groceries. A routine so established that Henrik had written it down as a rule to follow. How long had this been going on? Since 1987, when the man had died. Longer? The radio crackled, and I heard my name again. This time it was my father's voice, calling to me through decades of static. "Ethan, boy, come help your old man with these groceries." He died when I was 12, but the voice was perfect. Every inflection, every pause exactly right. I turned the volume up and let the static wash over me like white noise. Around 2 a.m., while I was restocking the candy display, I heard something that made me freeze. Whistling. Someone was whistling the tune I recognized. Danny Boy, the Irish ballad my grandmother used to hum while she cooked. But the sound was coming from aisle 3. I remembered rule number 1 and kept my eyes away from the security mirror. The whistling continued, slow and mournful, echoing through the store like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't coming from whatever lived in the mirror's reflection. This was something else entirely. The melody drifted through the aisles, beautiful and heartbreaking. I found myself humming along before I caught myself and stopped. Something about the tune was wrong, like it had too many notes or was being played in a key that shouldn't exist. When it finally faded away, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. I spent the rest of the night behind the counter, watching the clock and trying not to think about the old man in red flannel or where he went after buying his weekly groceries. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. At 6 a.m., Tom Dubois arrived for his usual coffee and breakfast sandwich. He looked around the store with the casual interest of someone checking for changes. "Everything all right last night?" he asked, counting out exact change for his purchase. "Fine," I said, though my voice still felt rough. "Just another night." Tom nodded and headed for the door, then stopped. "You know, Ethan, you're doing good work here. Henrik would be proud." "You knew Henrik well?" "Known him since we were kids. Good man, responsible man." Tom's expression grew serious. He understood that some jobs require more than just showing up and collecting a paycheck. Takes a special kind of person to do what needs doing, you know. After he left, I stood alone in the morning light, thinking about what he'd said. Henrik had lasted 43 years following these rules. 43 years of dead customers and phantom coffee and things living in freezers. I was starting to understand that this job was less about selling groceries and more about being a guardian, standing watch over something that needed watching. The question was, what happened to the people who couldn't handle it? Friday afternoon brought Lucien Gauthier to the store. I'd seen him around town a few times. A barrel-chested man in his 70s who drove a rusted Ford pickup and always paid for his cigarettes with wrinkled singles. Today he lingered after buying his usual pack of Marlboro Reds, studying me with sharp blue eyes that seemed older than his weathered face. "You're settling in all right then?" he asked, his accent thick with the French-Canadian inflection common among the older locals. "Getting the hang of it." I handed him his change, noting how his fingers were stained yellow from decades of smoking. "Henrik, he was a good friend of mine. Taught me to fish when we were boys." Lucien pocketed his cigarettes but didn't move toward the door. "Found his truck that morning, you know. Keys still in it, engine warm, like he'd just pulled up." My stomach tightened. The police never figured out what happened. "Police?" Lucien spat into his coffee cup. "City boys from Montpellier don't know the first thing about these woods. They looked for a man who went missing. Never occurred to them to look for what took him." Before I could ask what he meant, the door chimed and Mrs. Chen came in for her weekly lottery tickets. Lucien tipped his cap and shuffled out, leaving me with more questions than answers. That evening, I decided to do some research. The store had an ancient computer in the back office, one of those beige towers from the late 90s that took 5 minutes to boot up. The dial-up internet was slower than walking, but I managed to pull up the archives for the Waterbury record. The search for Henrik Lindqvist returned 12 results. Most were routine mentions, store hours during holidays, a brief article about supporting local businesses. But one headline made my blood run cold. "Local store clerk vanishes. Search continues for Maple Hollow Man." The article was dated February 15th, just 8 months ago. Henrik had worked his usual Thursday shift, locked up the store at 9 p.m. according to the security footage, and then simply vanished. His truck was found the next morning with the engine still running, driver's door open, footprints leading into the forest that stopped after 20 yards like he'd been lifted into the air. I clicked through more archives, searching for Miller Boy 1998. The results were more disturbing. Teenager found dead near general store. Apparent suicide puzzles. Investigators. Family disputes. Suicide ruin. Jason would never kill himself. Store clerk questioned in teen's death. No charges filed. Jason Miller, 16 years old, found hanging from a tree behind the Maple Hollow General Store on October 31st, 1998. The article mentioned that he'd been working part-time at the store, helping with inventory and stocking shelves. His body was discovered by the morning shift clerk, Henrik Lindqvist. According to the reports, Jason had been acting strangely in the weeks before his death, talking about voices calling his name, insisting that someone was living in the store's freezer section, claiming he'd seen dead people shopping after hours. His parents tried to get him help, but Jason refused to quit his job. He said he had to keep working, that something bad would happen if he left. On Halloween night, 1998, Jason Miller broke one of the rules. The final article I found was a follow-up piece from November's Store Protocols Under Scrutiny. Teen's death raises questions about night shift policies. Henrik had been interviewed by state investigators about his unconventional security procedures. He tried to explain about the rules, about the things that happened after dark, but the investigators dismissed his claims as the rambling of an old man trying to cover his liability. The case was closed as suicide, and Henrik continued working alone. 26 years of night shifts. 26 years of following the rules until whatever lived in the store finally claimed him too. I printed out what I could and shoved the pages into my jacket pocket. Outside, darkness was falling fast, and I had to get ready for another night. At exactly 9 p.m., I locked the front door and started my routine. The radio tuned to AM 1240 was playing some kind of agricultural report. Crop prices and weather forecasts for regions I'd never heard of. The coffee pot sat silent and innocent on its warming plate. But something felt different tonight. Wrong. The air seemed thicker, like a storm was coming, and my skin kept prickling with goosebumps despite the store's stifling heat. Around 10:30, someone knocked on the front door. I looked up from restocking the candy bars and felt my heart nearly stop. Tom Dubois stood outside, his face pressed against the glass, mouth moving like he was trying to tell me something urgent. His work truck was parked in the lot behind him, headlights still on. My first instinct was to unlock the door. Tom was a regular, a good guy who'd always been friendly. Maybe he'd forgotten something important, or there was an emergency in town. Then I remembered rule number 7. If someone tries to come in after that, especially if there's someone you recognize, do not let them in. That's not them anymore. Tom knocked again, harder this time. I could hear his muffled voice through the glass. "Ethan!" "Open up, kid. There's been an accident." But his eyes were wrong. They reflected the store's fluorescent light like an animal's eyes, flat and silver in the darkness, and when he smiled, trying to look reassuring, his teeth seemed too sharp. "Ethan?" "Not," Tom called again. "Your grandmother's been hurt. She's asking for you." My grandmother had been dead for 3 years. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking. The thing wearing Tom's face pressed closer to the glass, its breath fogging the window in patterns that looked almost like words. Behind it, Tom's truck sat empty, the driver's door hanging open just like Henrik's had been found. "Please, Ethan," it pleaded, its voice taking on a wheedling tone. "I'm hurt. Something in the woods. It got me. I need help." Red stains had appeared on not Tom's work shirt, spreading across the fabric like ink on wet paper. But the blood was moving wrong, flowing upward instead of down, defying gravity in ways that made my eyes water to watch. I turned my back on the door and walked to the counter, pulling out Henrik's rules with trembling fingers. Rule 7. Don't let them in. That's not them anymore. The knocking continued for another 20 minutes, growing more frantic and violent. The thing outside cycled through different voices. Tom's concerned tenor, my grandmother's gentle alto, even my father's gruff bass calling me son the way he used to when I was little. Finally, the knocking stopped. When I dared to look toward the front door, the parking lot was empty. Tom's truck was gone, though I hadn't heard it start or drive away. The rest of the night passed in relative quiet. The phantom coffee brewed its oily substance at 10:47. Something in the freezer section scratched half-heartedly at the doors around midnight. The radio called my name twice, but both times in voices I didn't recognize. I survived until dawn, but barely. When the real Tom Dubois came in at 6 a.m. for his usual coffee and breakfast sandwich, I studied his face carefully. His eyes were their normal brown, his smile genuine and warm. When he counted out change for his purchase, his fingers were calloused and human. "You look tired," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Long night," I managed. "They get easier," Tom said, though something in his expression suggested he knew exactly what kind of night I'd had. "Just remember, follow the rules, and you'll be fine. Start making exceptions and..." He shrugged. "Well, you saw what happened to Henrik." After he left, I sat behind the counter, with my head in my hands, thinking about Jason Miller and Henrik Lindqvist. Two people who'd worked this job, followed these rules until something went wrong. One had broken a rule and died for it. The other had vanished without explanation. I was beginning to understand that survival might not be the only concern. The question was becoming less about whether I could follow the rules, and more about how long I could follow them before whatever lived here decided I wasn't needed anymore. Saturday night brought the storm. I'd been working at the Maple Hollow General Store for 2 weeks, and I thought I understood the rhythm of the place after dark. I was wrong. Some nights, apparently, all hell broke loose. The day had been strange from the start. Customers seemed nervous, edgy, like animals sensing an approaching earthquake. Old Mrs. Bowyer bought 3 cases of bottled water and enough canned goods to last a month. When I asked if she was stocking up for something, she just shook her head and muttered something in French about les nuits sombres, the dark nights. Around 5 p.m., Margot Caron came in for the second time that week, which never happened. She bought a single pack of batteries and lingered at the counter, fidgeting with her coin purse. "Storm's coming," she said, though the sky outside was clear and cloudless. "Weather service isn't calling for rain until Tuesday." Margot's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Not that kind of storm, honey. The kind that brings things out of the deep woods. The kind that makes the rules harder to follow." She left without explanation, her ancient Subaru disappearing into the gathering dusk. By 8:30, I was alone with a growing sense of dread that sat in my stomach like a stone. At exactly 9 p.m., I locked the front door and felt the familiar weight of isolation settle over me. But tonight was different. Tonight, the store itself seemed to be holding its breath. The radio crackled to life on AM 1240, but instead of the usual talk shows or farm reports, it was playing music, old bluegrass songs that sounded like they'd been recorded through a layer of cotton. The melodies were familiar but wrong, like someone was playing them backward or in a minor key that shouldn't exist. At 10:03 p.m., the coffee pot started brewing. I went through the motions of not looking, not drinking, waiting for the cycle to complete. But when I turned to pour out the contents, the pot was empty. Bone dry, despite the brewing sounds and the rich aroma that still filled the air. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the empty glass carafe, before remembering to rinse it twice anyway. Rule followed, even when it made no sense. That should have been my first warning that this night would be different. Around 10:45, I heard footsteps upstairs. The store was single-story. There was no upstairs, but the sounds were unmistakable. Slow, measured steps crossing back and forth above the ceiling tiles, like someone pacing in a room that didn't exist. The fluorescent lights swayed slightly with each footfall, casting moving shadows across the aisles. I checked Henrik's rules again, but there was nothing about footsteps from above. Maybe this was new. Maybe whatever lived in the store was evolving, testing boundaries that had been stable for decades. The pacing continued for 20 minutes before stopping directly over the freezer section. Then I heard what sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. A scraping, grinding noise that made my teeth ache. Dust motes drifted down from the ceiling tiles, and one of the freezer units began to rattle violently. At 11:30, the lights in aisle 7 started their familiar flicker. I walked to the front counter and began my inventory count, speaking clearly into the oppressive air. Register tape, 4 rolls. Marlboro Red, 10 cartons. Camel Lights, 6 cartons. But the flickering didn't stop. If anything, it got worse, spreading to aisles 6 and 8. Soon, half the store was strobing in an epileptic rhythm that made my vision blur. I kept counting, raising my voice over the electric buzzing. Newport Menthol, 3 cartons. Parliament, 2 cartons. Virginia Slims, 1 carton. The flickering stopped all at once, plunging those aisles into complete darkness. In the sudden quiet, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Laughter. High, childlike giggling coming from the dark sections of the store. That wasn't in the rules either. By midnight, I was sweating, despite the store's air conditioning. 3 supernatural events had already violated the established patterns, and I was starting to understand why Henrik had looked so worn down in the old photographs I'd found in his desk. At 12 a.m. exactly, the front doorbell clanged. The old man in red flannel stood just inside the entrance, but something was wrong with his appearance. His clothes were torn and dirty, hanging in shreds that revealed pale skin underneath. His gray hair was matted with what looked like mud and leaves, and his flat, colorless eyes held a hunger that hadn't been there before. He moved through the store differently too, not with the purposeful efficiency I'd witnessed before, but with predatory stalking movements that made my skin crawl. Instead of shopping for his usual items, he wandered the aisles aimlessly, occasionally stopping to stare at products he'd never shown interest in before. When he finally approached the counter, he was empty-handed. "Where are your items?" I asked, then immediately regretted speaking first. Rule 3 was specific. Do not speak to him unless he speaks first. The dead man's head tilted at an angle that was definitely wrong, studying me with those winter gray eyes. When he smiled, his teeth were black with decay. "Don't need them tonight," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to come from multiple sources. "Tonight, I'm shopping for something else." He leaned across the counter, close enough that I could smell the grave dirt on his clothes and see the maggots writhing in his hair. "You're doing well, boy. Following the rules like a good little guard dog. But rules change. Everything changes." I wanted to back away, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The dead man reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "Henrik's last message," he said, placing it on the counter between us. "Thought you might want to read it before you join him." Then he walked back through the store and passed through the front door like mist, leaving me alone with the paper. My hands shook as I unfolded it. Henrik's handwriting was shaky, desperate. The rules are breaking down. 43 years I've held the line, but something's changing. The barriers are weakening. What we've been guarding is waking up, and I don't think the protocols are strong enough anymore. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. The thing in the basement wants out, and it's been testing the boundaries for months. Don't go down there. Whatever you do, don't go down there. Find another job. Get out while you still can. Henry L. Basement? I'd been working here for 2 weeks and never seen any basement access. But as I looked around the store with new eyes, I noticed something I'd missed before. A section of the floor behind the freezer units where the linoleum pattern didn't quite match. A rectangular outline, maybe 3 feet by 4 feet, almost hidden behind a display of motor oil. The radio suddenly exploded with static, loud enough to make me jump. Through the white noise, I heard voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all calling my name in a chorus of desperation and rage. Not just my family members this time, but strangers, children, voices speaking languages I didn't recognize. Ethan, Ethan, Ether. The chanting grew louder, and underneath it I heard something else, a rhythmic pounding, like a massive heartbeat. It was coming from below, from whatever lay beneath that mismatched section of floor. Thump, 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 thump. The freezer units began rattling in time with the rhythm. The lights overhead swayed like pendulums. In the distance, I heard the sound of glass breaking, one of the freezer doors finally giving way to whatever pressed against it from inside. I cranked the radio volume to maximum, but the static voices only got louder. They weren't coming from the speakers anymore. They were coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor itself. The entire store had become a mouth, screaming my name in unison. Something cold and wet touched my ankle. I looked down and saw black liquid seeping up through the cracks in the floor around the hidden basement access. It moved with purpose, spreading across the linoleum in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The smell hit me like a physical blow. Rot and copper and something else. Something organic and alive and ancient. The liquid reached the counter and began climbing the wooden legs like oil flowing upward. Where it touched, the wood blackened and warped. The cash register started smoking, its digital display cycling through random numbers faster than I could read. I backed toward the front door. Henrik's note clutched in my sweating palm. The locked deadbolt wouldn't budge. I was trapped inside with whatever was rising from beneath the store. The black liquid had covered half the floor now, and shapes were moving within it. Pale, elongated forms that might have been arms or tentacles, or something worse. The heartbeat rhythm grew louder, shaking dust from the ceiling tiles and rattling every can and bottle on the shelves. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The liquid receded back into the floor cracks. The static voices faded to silence. The heartbeat rhythm slowed to a whisper and disappeared. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet its endless hum. I stood in the sudden silence, breathing hard and trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The store looked normal again. Fluorescent lights humming softly. Freezer units running their usual cycles. Radio playing a late-night farm report about corn futures. But I could still smell the grave dirt and decay. Still feel the presence watching me from somewhere below. A new piece of paper had appeared on the counter beside Henrik's note. This one was fresh, written in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. The rules are just the beginning. What you guard is waking up. 7 seals, 7 protocols, 7 barriers between what sleeps and what feeds. Follow them perfectly, or become part of what hungers in the dark. I stared at the note until the words blurred together. When I looked up, Tom Dubois was standing outside the front door, his face pressed against the glass. The real Tom this time, I could tell by his eyes, brown and human, and filled with genuine concern. He mouthed something I couldn't hear through the glass, then pulled out his cell phone and typed a message. My own phone buzzed with a text. "Are you all right? saw the lights going crazy from the road. I unlocked the door and let him in, grateful for human contact after the horror I'd just experienced. "What happened here?" Tom asked, looking around the store. "Looked like a lightning storm, but there's not a cloud in the sky." "I'm not sure," I said, which was partially true. "Everything just went crazy for a few minutes." Tom nodded grimly. "Storm nights. They happen sometimes. Usually means something stirring down below." He paused, studying my face. "Henrik never told you about the basement, did he?" I showed him Henrik's note. Tom read it twice, his expression growing more serious with each word. "Yeah," he said finally. "That's what I was afraid of." Tom sat heavily in the plastic chair I kept behind the counter, Henrik's note spread on his knees. In the fluorescent light, he looked older than his 50-something years, worn down by secrets he'd carried too long. "How much do you know about this area's history?" he asked finally. "Not much. Small farming community, logging in the old days, tourism now." I poured myself coffee from the pot I'd started after letting him in. Real coffee this time, black and bitter and reassuringly normal. That's the sanitized version they tell the leaf peepers. Tom folded Henrik's note carefully and handed it back to me. The real history goes back to 1823, when the first settlement was established here. French-Canadian loggers, mostly, working the timber rights for a company out of Montreal. He paused, listening to the sounds of the store, the hum of the freezers, the distant buzz of the fluorescent lights, the quiet tick of the wall clock. Normal sounds that seemed fragile after what I'd witnessed earlier. "They found something in the woods," Tom continued, "deep in a cave system about half a mile from here. The company records from that time are mostly lost, but what survived, well, let's just say the loggers stopped working pretty quick after that." I leaned against the counter, trying to process what he was telling me. What did they find? Something that should have stayed buried, something old enough to make the Abenaki tribes avoid this entire valley for generations. Tom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The first settlers didn't know better. They built their homes, cleared their fields, started their families. And every few months, someone would disappear. Like Henrik. Like Henrik. Like Jason Miller. Like probably a dozen others over the years that nobody talks about anymore. Tom stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark forest that pressed close to the parking lot. By 1825, the settlement was gone, abandoned. The few survivors packed up and moved south, spread stories about the land being cursed. But people came back. Eventually. Around 1890, a Boston investor bought the land cheap and built the first version of this store. He hired local folks to run it. Figured he could make money selling supplies to the logging crews that were moving back into the area. Tom turned back to me, his expression grim. That's when they discovered the cave system extended right under this building. And that's when the first rules were written. I pulled out Henrik's list and spread it on the counter. 7 protocols that had seemed arbitrary just weeks ago now felt like battle plans drawn up by someone who understood warfare against enemies that didn't follow normal laws. "The store isn't really a store," I said slowly, working through the implications. "It's a guard post. Has been for over a century. Every night shift worker, every manager, every owner. They've all been guardians. Most don't last long, the ones who do." Tom shrugged. "Well, Henrik made it 43 years. That's some kind of record. What happened to him?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring at the mismatched section of floor behind the freezer units. Same thing that happens to all of us eventually. The thing down there gets hungry enough, smart enough, strong enough to test the barriers. Henrik's job was to maintain the containment. But some barriers require more than just following rules. What do you mean? The 7 protocols you follow every night. They're not just safety measures. They're rituals. Each one reinforces a specific aspect of the containment system. Tom pointed to Henrik's list. The coffee ritual. That's not about disposal. You're accepting communications from the entity, acknowledging its presence while refusing its offers. The radio protocol keeps you anchored to the human world when it tries to pull you into its influence. I thought about the voices calling my name through the static. Always people I loved and trusted. It was trying to get me to respond, to engage with it directly. Once you start talking back, answering its calls, you become part of its network. That's what happened to Jason Miller. He started answering the radio, started talking to the voices. Within a month, he was hearing them even when the radio was off. Tom walked over to the freezer section and stood near the hidden basement access. The old man in red flannel, Rule 3, he's not just a dead customer. He's the last guardian before Henrik's predecessor. Been making his weekly reports for 36 years now, checking that the seals are holding. Reports to who? To Henrik. To you now. Every Thursday he comes back to confirm the entity's containment status. If he ever buys different items, or the wrong amount, or shows up on a different night. Tom shook his head. That means something's changed down below. The implications make my stomach turn. And tonight, he looked different. Damaged. Because the containment is weakening. The storm you experienced, that wasn't random supernatural activity. That was the entity testing every aspect of the barrier system at once. Tom's expression grew grave. It's learning, adapting to the rules that have held it for over a century. How many people in town know about this? The selectman, the sheriff, maybe a dozen others. We've been managing this situation for 5 generations, keeping the roads clear, discouraging development, making sure the guardian position stays filled. Tom pulled out his phone and showed me a contact list. Emergency numbers. If things go really wrong, if the protocols start failing completely, you call these people, and we evacuate the area. I scrolled through the list. State emergency management, some kind of federal containment unit, numbers with Washington, D.C. area codes. This goes all the way to the federal government. There are 17 sites like this, scattered across New England, remnants from whatever was here before European settlement. Most are dormant, managed by local caretakers who think they're just maintaining historical properties. Tom took his phone back. 3 are still active. Maple Hollow is the most dangerous. Why? Because what's down there isn't just hungry, it's intelligent. It learns from every guardian, every interaction, every attempt to contain it. Henrik lasted 43 years because he was smart, careful, and ruthless when he needed to be. But even he couldn't stop it from evolving. Tom walked back to the counter and leaned against it, studying my face. The question now is whether you're strong enough to do what needs to be done. Which is, follow the rules perfectly. Never deviate, never make exceptions, never let sympathy or curiosity override the protocols. And when the time comes... He paused, choosing his words carefully. When the entity gets too strong for the current containment, you'll need to find a way to reinforce the seals. I thought about Henrik's note, his warning about not going into the basement. How do you reinforce the seals? There are ways. Methods that previous guardians developed over the decades. But they all require sacrifice. Sometimes it's just time, energy, years of your life spent maintaining the barriers. Sometimes. Tom looked toward the hidden basement access. Sometimes it requires more. Like what? Like feeding it something to keep it satisfied. Like going down there yourself when the time comes. Like making the choice Henrik made. Tom's voice grew quiet. He didn't disappear, Ethan. He went down into the basement one last time to reset the containment system manually. Bought us maybe another decade of stability. The weight of what he was telling me settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I wasn't just a night shift cashier following weird rules to avoid supernatural annoyances. I was a guardian, maintaining a prison that held something ancient and hungry, and patient enough to wait centuries for its chance at freedom. How long do guardians usually last? I asked. Varies. Jason Miller lasted 2 months before the pressure broke him. Henrik's predecessor made it 15 years. Most manage 3 to 5 years before they either break under the strain or... Tom shrugged. Or the entity finds a way to claim them. And you think I can handle this? I think you're already handling it. You followed the rules perfectly for 2 weeks, even when things got scary. That's more than most manage. Tom headed toward the door, then stopped. But Ethan, remember that the rules aren't just about protecting you. They're about protecting everyone. If you ever feel like you can't handle it anymore, if you're tempted to walk away or ignore a protocol, call me first. Don't make Henrik's mistake of trying to handle everything alone. After he left, I stood in the quiet store, looking at Henrik's list of 7 rules with new understanding. Each protocol was a barrier, a lock, a ritual designed to keep something unspeakable contained in the darkness below my feet. And I was the only thing standing between it and the world above. 3 days after Tom's revelation, everything went wrong. It started with the Hartley family from Connecticut. Parents and 2 young kids on their way back from a foliage tour in Stowe. Their GPS had routed them through our back roads when traffic tied up on I-89, and they pulled into the parking lot around 8 p.m., looking for directions and snacks. I sold them bottled water, granola bars, and a Vermont road atlas while their kids, maybe 8 and 10 years old, picked out candy from the display near the register. Normal family, normal transaction, except for the way the little girl kept staring at the freezer section and asking her mother if she heard the singing lady. There was no singing lady, but I knew what she was hearing. They left around 8:20, the father thanking me for the directions back to the interstate. I watched their Honda Pilot pull out of the parking lot and disappear down Route 100, red taillights swallowed by the darkness between the trees. At exactly 9 p.m., I locked the front door and began my nightly routine. The radio tuned to AM 1240 was playing some kind of religious program, a preacher with a thick southern accent discussing salvation and redemption. I left it on and settled behind the counter with Henrik's rules spread in front of me. The first sign something was wrong came at 9:23 p.m. A car pulled into the parking lot, the same Honda Pilot that had left an hour earlier. The headlights swept across the windows as it parked in the exact same spot. I watched through the glass as the father got out and walked toward the front door. He moved differently than before, with a stiff, puppet-like gait that made my skin crawl. When he reached the door, he knocked. 3 measured raps that echoed through the store. Rule 7 was crystal clear. Lock the front door at exactly 9 p.m. If someone tries to come in after that, especially if there's someone you recognize, do not let them in. That's not them anymore. The thing wearing the father's face knocked again, harder this time. Behind it, I could see the Honda Pilot with the rest of the family still inside. Shadowy figures in the back seat that might have been his wife and children, or might have been something else entirely. "Excuse me," the not father called through the glass. We need help. Our car broke down. But I could see the headlights still on, hear the engine running. Please, it continued, pressing its face against the window. My daughter is sick. She needs medicine. I backed away from the door, keeping my eyes fixed on Henrik's rules. Don't let them in. That's not them anymore. The simplicity of the instruction felt like a lifeline in the growing wrongness of the moment. The knocking stopped. Through the window, I watched the not father return to the Honda Pilot and drive away. But instead of heading toward Route 100, it circled around to the back of the store. A few minutes later, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the roof. The phantom coffee started brewing at 10:08, 3 minutes early. Instead of the usual rich aroma, it smelled like burning plastic and rotten eggs. When the cycle finished, the pot contained something that looked like coffee, but moved like thick syrup, with chunks of what might have been meat floating in it. I dumped it down the sink and rinsed the pot twice, trying not to breathe through my nose. At 10:45, all the lights in the store went out. Emergency power kicked in a few seconds later, bathing everything in the red glow of battery-powered exit signs. In that crimson light, the store looked different, older, more decrepit, as if decades of decay had suddenly become visible. The shelves sagged under the weight of products that weren't there during the day, and the floor was covered with a thin layer of something that might have been dust, or ash, or ground bone. I fumbled for my flashlight and switched it on, the white beam cutting through the red gloom. Where it touched the shelves, everything looked normal again. Campbell's soup, motor oil, candy bars. But in my peripheral vision, I could see the other version, the shadow store that existed parallel to this one. The radio crackled with static, then a voice I recognized spoke through the white noise. "Ethan? Ethan, honey, can you hear me?" My grandmother's voice, as clear as if she were standing next to me. "Ethan, I need you to do something for me. I need you to go down to the basement." My hand moved toward the volume knob before I caught myself. Rule 4. If you hear your name being called through the static, do not answer. But this wasn't just static. The emergency power had killed the radio's main functions. It shouldn't have been receiving anything at all. "Ethan, please. Henrik is down there and he's hurt. He needs your help." The voice was perfect. Every inflection, every pause exactly right. It sounded like my grandmother calling me to Sunday dinner, the way she used to when I was small. But my grandmother had been dead for 3 years, and Henrik had been gone for 8 months. I turned the radio volume up anyway, drowning the voice in static. That's when I heard the scratching from below. Something was clawing at the basement access, trying to break through from underneath. The mismatched section of floor began to buckle upward with each impact, and I could hear splintering wood and scraping metal as whatever was down there attacked the barriers that held it. The scratching grew louder, more frantic. Dust poured from the cracks around the hidden entrance, and one of the freezer units began sliding across the floor as the ground beneath it shifted. Then I heard children crying. The sound was coming from outside, high, plaintive wails that cut through the emergency lighting and radio static like knives. I knew without looking that it was the Hartley children, standing in the parking lot and calling for help. Except the Hartley family had left hours ago, and whatever was mimicking their voices had probably never been human at all. "Please help us," a little girl's voice called through the glass. "The scary man took our mommy and daddy. We're scared." I gritted my teeth and focused on Henrik's rules. Don't look where you shouldn't look. Don't answer when you shouldn't answer. Don't let them in after closing time. The scratching from below reached a crescendo, and suddenly, the basement access burst open. The mismatched section of floor lifted like a trapdoor, revealing a rectangle of perfect darkness that seemed to swallow my flashlight beam. A smell rose from the opening. Ancient earth and decay and something else. Something organic and hungry and wrong. A hand reached up from the darkness. Pale, elongated fingers with too many joints grasped the edge of the opening, followed by another hand, then an arm that bent in ways human arms weren't meant to bend. Something was climbing out of the basement. I ran to aisle 7 and started counting inventory, speaking loudly over the sounds of whatever was emerging from below. Register tape, 4 rolls. Marlboro Red, 9 cartons. Camel lights, 5 cartons. The emergency lights flickered, casting everything in strobing red shadows. In the intermittent darkness, I caught glimpses of movement. Something tall and wrong-shaped pulling itself up from the basement, unfolding like a spider emerging from its burrow. Newport Menthol, 2 cartons. Parliament, 1 carton. The thing had fully emerged now. I could hear it moving through the store, knocking products off shelves as it navigated between the aisles. Its breathing sounded like wind through broken glass, and each footstep left wet marks on the linoleum. Virginia Slims, 1 carton. Camel Crush, 3 cartons. The children's crying outside grew louder, more desperate. They were right against the windows now. Small hands pressed against the glass, their breath fogging the surface in patterns that spelled out words I couldn't read. The thing from the basement was getting closer. I could smell it now. Grave dirt and stagnant water and something sweet and rotting. My voice cracked as I continued the inventory count. But I kept going. Lucky Strike, 2 cartons. American Spirit, 4 cartons. Something cold touched the back of my neck. I spun around and found myself face to face with Henrik Lindqvist. But this wasn't the kindly old store clerk from the newspaper photos. This Henrik was wrong in every possible way. Skin gray and waxy, eyes like black holes, mouth hanging open to reveal teeth that had grown too long and sharp. "Hello, Ethan," it said in Henrik's voice. "Time to come downstairs." I backed away, still clutching my flashlight and Henrik's list of rules. The not Henrik followed, moving with that same puppet-like gait I had seen from the fake father earlier. "The protocols are failing," it continued conversationally. "The barriers are breaking down. We need a new guardian to reset the system from the inside." "I'm not going down there." "Of course you are." Not Henrik smiled, and black liquid dripped from between its 2 long teeth. "Because if you don't, I'm going to visit the Hartley family. And after then, every family in Maple Hollow. Every child, every elderly person, everyone you're supposed to protect." Through the windows, I could see more shapes moving in the parking lot. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all pressing against the glass with pale hands and empty eyes. The thing wearing Henrik's face leaned closer. "Choose, Ethan. Your life or theirs. One guardian sacrifice, or a town full of victims." I looked at the open basement access, at the darkness that waited below, and realized I was facing the same choice Henrik had made 8 months ago. I looked at the basement access, at the Henrik thing waiting with its black-toothed smile, at the shapes pressed against the windows. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Fine," I said, "but I do this my way." The not Henrik tilted its head, considering. "What way?" Instead of answering, I grabbed the emergency fire axe from behind the counter and brought it down hard on the creature's skull. The blade sank deep with a wet crack, and the thing staggered backward, black liquid spraying across the register. It didn't die, didn't even seem particularly bothered, but it bought me the seconds I needed. I ran to the radio and cranked the volume to maximum, filling the store with static loud enough to shake the windows. Then I started breaking Henrik's rules, one by one, systematically dismantling every barrier that held the entity in place. I looked directly into the security mirror above aisle 3, meeting the gaze of something that writhed in dimensions my eyes couldn't properly process. I answered the voices calling my name through the static, shouting, "Here! I'm here!" until my throat was raw. I opened every freezer door in the section, releasing clouds of vapor that moved with purpose and intent. The emergency lights strobed faster, the building groaned like a ship in a storm, and the basement access widened as more of the floor collapsed inward. But instead of containing the entity, I was forcing it to reveal itself completely. "What are you doing?" the Henrik thing shrieked, its borrowed voice distorting into harmonics that hurt to hear. "Something Henrik never tried," I said, pulling the last item from my pocket. A road flare Tom had given me during his emergency preparedness speech. I struck it against the counter, filling the store with brilliant red light that cut through the supernatural darkness like a blade. The entity recoiled, its various manifestations flickering like bad television reception. In the flare's harsh glow, I could see it clearly for the first time. Not separate creatures, but extensions of one vast thing that filled the basement and spread root-like through the cave system beneath Maple Hollow. It was ancient, hungry, and patient, but it was also trapped, dependent on the very barriers I'd been maintaining. The rules weren't just containment, they were a feeding system, channeling small amounts of human fear and energy to keep the entity stable but controlled. Henrik had understood this. That's why he'd gone into the basement, not to sacrifice himself, but to starve the thing by cutting off its controlled food supply. Without the careful rituals, without the measured supernatural encounters, the entity would consume everything around it until it burned itself out. I dropped the flare into the basement access and stepped back. The explosion of light and heat that followed shook the entire building. Every window in the store shattered simultaneously, and a sound like steam escaping from a massive boiler filled the air. The shapes outside vanished like smoke, and the Henrik fame collapsed into a pile of clothes that had never contained a body. When the fire department arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by Tom Dubois, who'd been monitoring the situation from his truck, they found me sitting in the parking lot, covered in glass cuts, and staring at the smoldering ruin of the Maple Hollow General Store. The official report blamed a gas leak. The insurance company paid out without questions. By spring, a new Cumberland Farms had been built on the site, with modern refrigeration units and LED lighting, and a basement that was properly sealed with concrete and steel. I moved back to Burlington and finished my degree at UVM. Sometimes I dream about that night, about the sound the entity made as it died. But mostly I sleep fine. The nightmares belong to whoever's working the late shift at the Cumberland Farms now. Because some hungers don't stay buried, and some jobs always need doing. Even when the rules change,